Hello, my name is Brian Rixon. I am a therapist with Southwest Guidance Center in Liberal, Kansas. Welcome to Patriot Day. Many caring, dedicated, and selfless individuals fill various roles every day to protect and save those who need a hero. Whether a first responder, a military service member, or a veteran of either, you know what it's like to be someone's hero. For the next moment, I am going to share with you the real costs that often come with being a hero and the rewards of learning how to be your own hero. Before I begin to share with you the impact that trauma has on first responders and the understanding of the brain and how it works in relation to trauma and events in life, as well as some research and facts about how trauma affects first responders. And then lastly, some barriers to seeking help as first responders and how you can take care of yourselves for those in first responder roles who are impacted by repeated trauma and tragedy in those roles. I first want to share with you a couple of quotes by two people in history that came to understand the delicacy of the mind and how it's impacted, as well as the power of the mind in how ourselves can heal ourselves and navigate through the difficulties of tragedy and hardships in life. This first quote is by a gentleman by the name of Swami Vivekananda, who was a 19th century Indian Hindu monk who was strongly influential in bringing yoga to the United States, or had the influence of yoga coming to the United States. And his quote, as you see here, he said, "It is the strong mind that hews its way through 1,000 difficulties." And so Vivekananda really understood how powerful the mind is in navigating its way through difficulties that many of us face in life, and the ability that it has to do so. This other quote is by a famous Roman emperor that many of you will recognize, Marcus Aurelius, who said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. If you realize this, and you will find strength." Let's begin to discuss some of the impact that trauma has on first responders and doing that kind of work that heroes do every day. Some of the common issues that you'll see here that affect pretty much everybody in a first responder role are things like time away from family, sleep disruption because of shift work, or because of things that impact you emotionally and mentally, and because of the rigorous training and the rigorous work that comes from the role of being a first responder. Worry, stress, some other issues such as nightmares, and even down there at the bottom, you'll notice that even bullying and even sexual harassment or assault happens in the ranks of first responders, and not just from command down to subordinates, but even among peers, and sometimes even hazing still happens among first responder ranks. So let's move on and discuss some of the higher concern issues, which tend to be a little more serious and more important in needing addressed. And these are things like depression, or what you might, commonly think as being a problem as somebody, experiencing PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. Other things like substandard performance, instability in the workplace or even in the family or in the community. Emotional numbness is a very common high concern among first responders, because when you're dealing with trauma repeatedly, emotional numbness tends to affect a lot of people because because we learn to kind of separate ourselves emotionally from the line of work because it's a protective measure or protective factor that we do in our minds. But also it can result because of something that we call secondary trauma or vicarious trauma, which I'll explain more later when we get into the underpinnings of how trauma and first responder type work affects the brain and the body. Some other high concerns, things like, of course, things related to post-traumatic stress disorders such as anxiety, flashbacks, hypervigilance, which is just being on edge, like you're always being alert and waiting for something to happen. Kind of that proverbial waiting for the pen to drop. High rates of substance abuse and dependence among first responders. Of course, divorce, isolation. Next, I'd like to discuss with you this concept called resiliency theory. Many of you might have heard something about this or heard about this idea of being resilient. I'm not quite sure if this concept is being taught as a part of training as first responders, either for law enforcement or firefighting or emergency medical services. I do know that it is, in the past probably 10 years, has been integrated as a part of training in the military services, as a part of training soldiers to learn how to be more resilient and bounce back from the impact of combat and training and just high rates of training and being away from family, a high tempo, if you will. Resiliency theory is not a new concept. It's actually an older concept. It's been around for probably about 80 years, maybe 60 years at the earliest. But resilience, defined by the American Psychological Association, as you see, is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or even significant sources of risk. And so basically what this means in a nutshell is it's kind of like math is the best way I can describe it. You want to have more positive things going for you than you do negative things. Positive things can be like being able to read, having a support network, having an education, having good enough income to be able to provide a home, food, and things for you and your family. Simple things that we tend to take for granted or overlook. Good health, things of that nature. Negative factors, or what we would call risk factors, would be things like not having good health, not having a support network, not having any mentors or somebody to look up to, things of that nature. And so basically that's just kind of what resiliency theory is just taking a look at what a person has in their life to be able to make them more likely to adapt and to bounce back from adverse situations or trauma, which all first responders face in some sort of way. So I just discussed a little bit about protective factors and risk factors. Protective factors are basically positive things in our life, risk factors being those negative things. As you'll see here, there are several different sources of how resiliency theory came about. The first thing there, that Ordinary Magic is actually the title of a book by Ann Maston, who is a professor at the University of Minnesota and works in the area of child development. And she's done a lot of work over her career of about 30 or 40 years studying the development of children and studying what it takes to make a child successful in life, and meaning that in general, not particularly in one sort of way, whether they're good at business or they become rich or anything like that, but successful in the sense that they have overall good health, they have hope, they're working towards their goals in life, things like that. And so she did some research and ended up writing a book based on it called Ordinary Magic. And it's basically her label of this idea of resilience in a person. Originally, where a lot of this resilience sort of took hold is from a study done around World War II time. And there was a lot of professors at universities and other people outside of the academic area interested in the impact and the effects of war on children. And so a group of these people traveled over to Europe, into the European theater, and during the last period of World War II and after, and did some interviewing and did some case studies and did some research and really looked into the effect of tragedy and trauma and stress on children and what made them more likely to adapt and to bounce back from that and to become successful and healthy. And so they first started identifying today what we know as the concept of resiliency theory and this idea of protective factors and risk factors. And then the other thing was this 20-year longitudinal study done on children in high risk areas. And I had the fortunate opportunity to meet with and train under a doctor that was a part of the study. And they did a study on kids that came in and were raised in areas of poverty and high crime. And what they found as a result of this study later on is that the kids in those areas that were most successful in life are those kids that had more protective factors, basic things like good dental hygiene, the ability to read, good mentors, at least 2 or 3 positive role models in their life. Basic stuff like that, access to clothes and food, things that a lot of us probably take for granted. So how do we become more resilient? Well, some of the ways here, like developing active coping skills, learning ways to adapt and to deal with stressful times that first responders deal with, such as having supportive social network, coping skills like learning how to use positive thinking, learning how to think through situations that would cause most people to kind of throw their hands up after a certain period of time of doing that kind of work. Cognitive flexibility, just learning to be able to adapt in your mind to situations and being able to learn how to think things in a different way to be able to cope with what you deal with from day in, day out. Of course, obvious stuff like attending to your physical well-being, having some sort of spiritual life, whatever that might mean for you, but having some sense of, as we say, a moral compass, higher up or something to believe in, which gives us hope. It gives us something to strive for further on in life, rather than just living in that moment. This next section I want to talk about with you is about burnout and compassion fatigue. They're two different concepts, but they are closely related. Earlier I mentioned briefly at the beginning about vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. This is basically compassion fatigue, and what this is basically the emotional strain that comes from repeatedly being exposed to working with those that are suffering from some kind of traumatic event. So those that are responding to vehicle accidents, EMS, firefighters, you see somebody that's injured, or you pull up to a house fire, or you respond to a domestic violence situation such as law enforcement or a criminal situation, or different kinds of things where anybody is exposed to a traumatic event, either big or small. Over a period of time, people can easily get what we call compassion fatigue. And this differs, like it says, from burnout, even though it can coexist, in that compassion fatigue can be caused from either one case or due to a cumulative exposure to several cases of trauma. And the way this differs from burnout is that compassion fatigue is trauma related, whereas burnout is more of repeated exposure to emotional stress and exhaustion, and resulting with withdrawal, not just physical withdrawal, but mental and emotional withdrawal from your role, from your work and your responsibilities. And this comes from just increased workload and stress, high demand, uh, you know, always having to um, be there on the job, and just really being stretched thin. And so compassion fatigue um, and burnout can both result in that feeling that you get where you feel like you're just kind of on cruise control. Mother Teresa, um, of course, was kind of the epitome of compassion and care towards others because she did this for all her life. But one of the things that she realized in doing care and compassion to individuals and families and people in other countries and all over the world, she realized that people get exhausted from taking care of other people and being exposed to the trauma and to the hardships of other people. And so she wrote in her plan to her superiors one time that she required them to take a year off every 4 to 5 years of service to kind of regroup, to kind of heal, to kind of get back to themselves from the serious impact that taking care of others has. Some of the stages of burnout that you see here, things to look for, apathy, stagnation, just kind of getting, on cruise control, just going through the motion, things like that. Some symptoms of compassion fatigue, your emotional intensity increases, your behavior or judgment gets impaired, kind of lose sense of self-worth or emotional modulation, or being able to regulate your emotions or control them, if you will. Just loss of hope and meaning. And that doesn't have to be anything significant. That can just be like, every day coming into work and being like, what's the point in this? This stuff is just going to keep happening. So, what are we doing? And really kind of downplaying the important role that you guys have as first responders and heroes to these people in need. Just some tips for managing compassion fatigue, some things to do. Have somebody to talk to peers. Exercise and eat properly. Take time off when you can. Understand that the pain you feel is normal. These kinds of things are important because as first responders, there's this kind of unwritten expectation among first responders that you need to be tough and that you're weak if you express anything like this, that you're feeling depressed or anything like that, or that there's no need to do that, or if you do, then you can't hack it. You know, very unhealthy myths out there about this. Some things to don't do. You know, don't self-medicate. Don't just job hop or make rash decisions like changing relationships or things like that. Don't blame others. Those are some things to not do. Some clinical issues that can arise from burnout and compassion fatigue and just the impact of trauma are things like, of course, PTSD, depression, marital and family issues. People don't think about this, but internet and gaming addiction, suicide, and we'll talk about how prevalent these kinds of things are here in just a couple minutes. Um, the next thing that I want to share with you is to begin sharing some of the underpinnings or the understanding of how the brain functions and why we respond in certain ways. Everybody's heard of the fight or flight response. I want to share a little bit about the difference between the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, which for a lot of you first responders, you're going to understand this already because of part of your job. But basically, if you look to the left here, we have the sympathetic system, and to the right, we have the parasympathetic system. The main thing to understand about this is that when we get faced with some kind of trauma or emergency or threat, and not just a threat to us, but in our roles as first responders, a threat to somebody else, certain things happen within thousandths of a second in the brain. What happens is a chemical or a neurotransmitter in the brain called adrenaline gets pumping really fast in the brain. And that's what gives us extra strength. It gives us extra alertness and extra abilities, and it heightens our sensory information and puts us on our toes. And it's what often makes first responders very good at their job and very good at responding in crisis mode. That's probably what drew you to what you do as first responders, is because you do well under pressure, or you're very interested and have a knack for helping people, and so you've learned to do well under pressure. And then on this other side, when the threat no longer is deemed a threat and things calm down, our brain calculates that really quick, and an opposite neurotransmitter called noradrenaline kicks in. And so the parasympathetic part of the system is responsible for homeostasis or balance in the body and the mind, and also digestion. And so these two act as kind of a balancing act. And so when we feel a threat, it's kind of like pressing down on the throttle of a vehicle, and things get ramped up. And then when something's not considered a threat anymore and things are safe, then we can let off the throttle feed and things kind of start to simmer down. Next, I want to share a little bit about brain function specifically. I'm not going to share everything about on this display, but I do want to share certain things like the hippocampus, which is right in here in the middle of the brain, and it's responsible for memory, and it's responsible for long-term memory, immediate memory, and recent memory. And then I want to explain about the amygdala, and there's two of them in the middle of our brains, and they're about the size of a kidney bean. And what this part of the brain is responsible for is for regulating emotions and assessing threat. And so this part of our brain is a part of our what we call our primitive brain, both of these. And so whenever we feel threatened in any kind of way, not just physically, but emotionally or mentally, or we're put on edge, it's because this part of our brain is activated and says something's wrong, need to get ready to do something. And so this is where all your training as a first responder comes in good. And that's why you train and you train and you train, so that when this kicks in, you're able to function and do what you're trained to do. Because when we get the sympathetic part of our system kicks in and we notice that threat and that adrenaline kicks in, the outer cortex of the brain that's responsible for making judgment, planning, making decisions, the energy to that part of the brain kind of gets diminished. So that's when all that good training kicks in and that habit becomes necessary. And again, that part of the brain is responsible for emotions. And that's why also the things that we recall the most tend to have the most emotion tied to them. All right, this next section I want to talk about is some research that can kind of clear up and make some sense of the immediate but more long-term effect and impact of trauma, or more specifically repeated trauma, on first responders. And this was some research done by Levy Gigi, Richter Levin, and Carey about 6 years ago. There's some very good research and lends a lot of good insights into the impact of trauma on first responders. Just some general things about this study. Again, it was done on several first responders, and also done on the control side of this with some people from the same area that shared some same characteristics but weren't first responders. Included in this was some behavioral studies and some neuroimaging that showed traumatic exposure is linked to brain and cognitive dysfunction. Moving on, this study focused on first responders, specifically 35 active duty firefighters, 32 CSI police, and then the control part of the study, which is 23 civilians with matched controls. And they were matched in the same age, same gender, and years of education. And I won't go into the details of this study for the sake of time, but I do want to share that this was a good random selected study. So the results of this study are very reliable and very transferable to most anywhere in any region for first responders. The results of this study were that in all the groups, the firefighters, the police, and the control study, all the groups were able to equally learn and retain positive and negative stimulus outcome association, meaning that they were all able, with their brain functions, to realize a positive outcome or a negative outcome based on the stimulus that triggered it. Now, the other part of the results was that they found in what you see there, they call it cue context reversal. The cue being the trigger or the stimulus, and then the context being what these first responders found themselves in, or what resulted actually. And so what they found is that with the CSI police, that they were less able over time to see a negative to positive cue reversal, meaning that over time, the more police were exposed to traumatic situations as a part of their job, it was harder for them to see a positive outcome come from a negative cue. When they got told that you're going to respond to this, as time went on, they were less likely in their minds to be able to see the possibility of something positive coming out of that, because they just got used to being exposed to trauma. So that was the cognitive deficit impact on police. With firefighters, they were less able to see a negative to a positive context reversal, and so they got so exposed to the negative context that it was opposite for them. And again, some of the matched characteristics, that all three groups were similar in levels of IQ, and there were no significant differences in all the measures between the firefighters and CSI police, so all the first responders. Some suggestions from this study are that first responders, due to their role, are more external thinking and have difficulty in introspective feelings, simply meaning that it's easy for first responders to kind of detach from their emotional side because of their role, and often do that inadvertently, but also do that purposefully as a protective factor. Um, Both groups of the first responders showed low levels of hope, suggesting that over time they're less determined in achieving their goals and how to achieve them. So, over time, being exposed to repeated trauma really affects how people in the role of first responders look at hope and the future. And then lastly, repeated trauma exposure often causes first responders to avoid unfamiliar places, people. They tend to isolate and are a lot more alert and cautious. Okay, real quickly, I just want to share some facts with you and statistics on the impact of trauma. Um, as you see here, amongst the three primary areas of first responders that most people think about, EMS, firefighters, and police, there were some statistics done on those that experience depression, those that experience stress or PTSD, and also the prevalence of those that experience SI, what we is called suicidal ideation, just having thoughts of suicide, and those that attempt it. And as you can see there, what we found is that a significant number in all categories experience all of those, more than we would want to experience any significant clinical issues. But what I found in some of my research, what was real concerning and really high, is that the stress and PTSD tended to be over 50% in the firefighter area. And so that's significantly high for a clinical issue in a category of any population. And that the same thing with suicide thinking and attempts was really high. And so, as you see there with EMS and police, all those other clinical issues are just as significant. And one of the interesting things about law enforcement that I found in the statistics is that some of the statistics may be underrepresented because of a lack of interdepartmental sharing. And so I think that can be transferable to all areas of first responder because of that sense of I don't want to be weak and things like that. So I think that there's probably some underreporting from people in these studies, which is even more concerning because then that leads us to believe how many more people out there are suffering from clinical issues and things that can be managed and treatable to help these people in their role. Just some other interesting facts that heavy and binge drinking was reported in 50% of the male firefighters and 39.5% of female firefighters. So there's a lot of self-medicating going on out there as first responders. Another one that I'll share with you on this next page is that 15 years later, EMS responders, after responding at Ground Zero at 9/11, there in New York, 17% of them still experience depression and 7% with PTSD. This was 15 years later. And so there's a lot of first responders out there still struggling with these significant clinical issues and hopefully are getting help. But I would imagine it's safe to say that there's many first responders out there not seeking help and getting the help that they need, not just professional help, but even within the peer and support network, even within online and other anonymous resources, which I'll share at the end of this presentation. Another thing that I thought was neat, and I'm very glad to hear, is that Emergency dispatchers often get left out or don't aren't seen as being a first responder, but they are, because these are the people that are a perfect example in their role of how you can be exposed to secondary trauma. They may not be responding to the actual scene, but they hear it and they go through it, and that is still being exposed to trauma. And so there are some laws being done in the states to now recognize them as first responders. A lot of money, as you see there, is spent every year in healthcare and lost productivity due to the impact of stress and trauma on just first responders alone. I next want to talk to you about some barriers. Folks, this is an important area to recognize because not just with all of mental health is there stigmatization with getting help, or stigmatization or this bad view or rap put on people who deal with mental or emotional health issues, but especially in the first responder community. And here are some of the reasons. One, because the view of others, not just peers, but people within the community that see you guys as heroes and and think of you guys as impermeable or invincible because of what you do and because of your strength and because of your resilience and your ability to continue to save and help others. Think of, as little kids, when your view of when you're in grade school and you get to go visit the fire station, and just remember the impression that that left on you, the fire trucks, the firemen, all the stuff that they do, the visiting an ambulance or talking to a police officer, or having the DARE program, or police officers come and talk about drugs. You have this sense of awe and authority. Well, that grows on people and that doesn't leave people, and so they have that view. And so often there can be that stigma for first responders that I can't go get help because I'll be seen as weak, or they'll think less of me as a first responder, and that's not true at all. We're human, and if anything, you're stronger for seeking help and learning how to take care of yourself so you can continue to be a hero to others when they need you. The myths of getting help, the things out there like I can't be helped, or the things that it'll get back to my officer or my supervisor or whoever. Not being able to trust other people. Um, Diminishing of self-esteem, goes towards that view that you and others have of yourself in that role. Um, the lack of parity to medical coverage. Sometimes in first responder roles, even though that may be local and state government, you still sometimes don't get maybe the best medical coverage to cover mental health or emotional health services. There is a lot of services out there, not just professional, but paraprofessional, and they don't all cost. Many of them are free, and I'll share those with you at the end. Some of the hazards to your job as first responders are, your own personal safety, lack of sleep, long work hours. The culture of the profession can be a barrier. Things like your role traits versus self-surrender to self-care. That idea that, what, I can help others because that's my job, and that's okay. But it's not okay for me to get help because, I'm a first responder. I should be able to handle this because I know what to do for people when I help them. And so we forget that we're human and that it is okay to need help and to get help. Um, the peer pressure, department pressure, man up, or just leave the job on the job site. Don't take it home with you. All these cliches and things that develop into the culture of what you do as first responders, and that make it difficult and leave this illusion as if you can't go get help, or if you do, then you're going to look weak, or you're going to make this department look weak. And believe it or not, that's some of the bullying that goes on out there and is very common. society's expectations, just like I shared with you. Idealization is always being strong and tough that develops from childhood. How do we move past these barriers? Well, there's several things, and all of them are important. First of all, education, realizing that there are barriers, realizing that there is help out there, and that it's okay. Being aware that you're not the only one. There are many first responders out there that suffer from mental and emotional stress or problems, and that's okay. That's just the nature and cost of being a hero and doing what you do. Um, Being prepared for this to happen. Don't say, well, if it happens, then I'll go get help. No, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of how will this affect you and when it's going to affect you. That's the realization of it all and what your response is going to be. So let me jump into some quick self-care. Some healthy practices to have are, leisure activities, spiritual health, that moral compass, practice mindfulness, and other preventive type things. Take time out for yourself and your family. Basic things that we forget about but we take for granted. There's several training programs out there available to first responders in their units, some of which the Southwest Guidance Center will provide to your units to help you guys be prepared to be able to handle and manage this repeated trauma so that it impacts you as least as possible. Things like assist class, which is applied suicide intervention skills training, resiliency training, psychological first aid, so forth and so on. You've got people in the community, support groups, pastors, workshops, different things out there to help you. Professional help, people like myself, therapists, they're specially trained with different types of therapies to help people treat PTSD or depression or other types of issues that naturally develop because of what you do and your exposure to trauma. So don't just, pick up the phone and just go with the first person. Look for people that specialize in this kind of treatment and training. It's just like shopping. You want to get the best bang for your buck. Peer care, use buddy systems, mentoring systems. Some of the best training that I've ever seen include mentoring systems in units, just like in the military. Um, there are people that are implement evidence-based intervention models, SISM trained. People that are trained in that and have done that, like myself. People that are certified in that can come when you've been exposed to a significant tragedy that really hits your unit hard, or a couple people. People like myself can come out and debrief and de-stress and kind of help work through that to help increase the resilience of not just yourself but your team. Use what you have. Use part of what's been a part of your training as first responders. Um, Consider the fitness of your efforts. Utilize organizational and community mental health providers, uh, programmatic planning, peer support teams. Um, and just like in Houston, they, of course it's a big city, they have their own psychologists. Even though most of you may work in part-time or even volunteer positions, you have access to these professionals in the community. Um, you know, Demystifying the stress response. It's cultural norm of strength and self-sufficiency versus the lie of weakness. Um, be persistent and be patient. Go to your peer survivors. Don't wait on them to seek help on their own. Find people out in your unit that need the help and be helpful for them and normalize this for them. This is normal. This is common. This is not just for weak people, because there is no weak people. You're human. And this is going to be a part of what you do. Do check-ins. Do some education on this. Plan ahead. Have a plan for this. You guys do mass cows. You guys do all kinds of trainings to prepare for your role. Make this a part of that training. That's the end of my presentation. I really appreciate you guys being patient with me. Um, staying attentive and letting me roll through this really quickly. I knew I threw a lot of information out at you, but I want you guys to have everything that you need as heroes to be able to be your own hero and to heal yourself and to make yourself the best that you can be, to be the best for others, which is what you guys do day in and day out. I salute you, I respect you, and I appreciate everything that you guys do and what you do. And so I'll just leave these next couple of slides up with resources for a few seconds so that you can take note of them. And just know that there's help out there. And if you have any questions, please get a hold of me, or please get a hold of somebody at the college and have them get a hold of me, and I can share any of this information with you and would love to chat with you more if you need that.